Good evening, everyone. My name is Leanne Lutz, and I'm sitting in Durban in South Africa, and I'm incredibly honored to be in this moment with an incredible group of human beings to celebrate this incredible film by Jamila. I'd like to take a moment also just on behalf of the Encounters Festival just to offer a small apology for the delay and the technical glitches in the screening of the film, but they assure us that the film is still available and it is still streaming. So we hope that everyone will take advantage of continuing to watch and to go back to see this beautiful film. So I would like to begin by offering a very gentle introduction to this extraordinary group of people before we start the discussion, because it's been such an honor to watch the film. It's a film that moved me in terms of its many layers and levels in terms of the narratives that it offered. But I'd like to introduce Jamila, the filmmaker, to say thank you so much for sharing your work in South Africa with us. And this is a film that is very timeless. It's a film that provokes, and it's a film actually in the end just about love, humanity, and the rightness of being. And I hope that we get to talk about it. So it's an honor to be with you and to share the film. Thank you so much. I would also like to welcome George Faison, and I'm sort of a little bit humbled and awed to be in your presence. He was an Ailey dancer from 1966 to 1970. He's a very strong voice in the film, and continues to be a theatre maker and choreographer, and just really beautiful to have the elders in the room, and just so wonderful. Thank you very much. And then two of my sister and brother countrymen, I'd like to welcome Gregory Makoma, who is based in Johannesburg in South Africa, although I believe he's sitting in Manchester at the moment. Gregory is the artistic director of Uyani Dance Theatre. He's a choreographer, a dancer. He's an activist. He's a voice of truth in our country, and always a pleasure and an honor to have him and to talk with him. So welcome, Greg. And then to someone that I care very deeply about, I'd like to welcome Tobili Mapanga. She's an artist, a choreographer, and arts administrator. She's also doing her master's degree where she's looking at the narratives of Black women's bodies as choreographers in South Africa, and just really beautiful to have her voice with us. So welcome, Toby, as well. So when I watched the film, apart from being deeply moved and going into a history that is familiar and yet not familiar, one of the things that struck me in watching the film was this extraordinary, there's a Nigerian writer called Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and she wrote a beautiful little book that says we should all be feminists, which is, of course, essential reading for everyone. But one of the things that she says in the book that I loved so much was she talks about the violence of a single narrative. And she talks about the way in which when we reduce identity politics to one issue or to one identity, we forget about the intersections of identities and of people's lives. And one of the things that I felt when I watched Ailey, Jamila, was that I thought that if anyone had understood the intersections of identity was the way in which you constructed this film, because on one level, of course, it's a history and a biography of this extraordinary choreographer. On another level, it's the story about the civil rights movement, about being an artist and what it meant to have a voice around being Black, being an artist. It's also a film about the HIV/AIDS pandemic. It's a story about that generation and silence and the violence of silence around that. And in the end, of course, it's also this incredible film that just is about humanity, about striving, about longing, about loneliness, and about the triumph of the human spirit to leave a legacy as Ailey did. And I thought I'd like to ask you, when you set out to make this film, when you encountered this extraordinary man who we all know as a choreographer and someone who defines Black dance in the American context, but you went so much deeper, and I'm interested in terms of your process of research and how you got us there.
Yeah, well, thank you. First of all, it is really humbling to be here with all of you. I just am, the hope for the film was that it would have a truly broad reach. And so to know that it's being screened in South Africa and people are, international audiences are also getting to take the film in is just very deeply meaningful. And I'm a little nervous. So here we go. But Yeah, I mean, the research process really began with his voice. We early on got access to 20 hours of audio recordings that Mr. Ailey conducted in the last year of his life with somebody who was going to help him co-author his autobiography. And it was in that, it was in those tapes that I felt like we really found the sort of pillars of the journey the film would take. And he was really engaging in, yes, a practice of remembering his life, but you could hear in the way that the discussion was going that it felt as if he was leaving the physical space of that hotel room where he was, giving testimony really to his experiences, and that he was back in those times, sort of reliving them in this very kind of like visceral, open, emotional way. And we just knew that if we could get out of his way and just allow him to kind of tell his own story, that we would find ourselves on the right track. And so there was a vulnerability and an openness in that discussion, and all the, I think all that he was and all that he wanted to sort of share with the world was really in this kind of treasure of material. Combined with that, it was very important. We early on decided, this really has to be his kind of lens on the world, and then also hearing testimony from those who worked most closely with him and experienced him firsthand. So we kind of early on made the decision not to include. I worked with scholars to kind of understand the larger kind of aspects of the story. I interviewed a couple scholars, but we decided that their voices wouldn't be the voices that sort of carried in the film, because we really wanted it to feel kind of deeply, deeply personal. So we started really with his voice. And what I loved was a real sense of his point of view on the world, that he was a very kind of tactile, he was like very open to the textures and the surrounding and things around him. He spoke in a kind of poetry. There's a line that's no longer in the film, but was in there for a very long time. And he would say, Texas is hot. The sun comes up like thunder, and just that is a way and so then soon we thought the next layer of research, well, what is the visual imagery that's going to help support this? And what is the visuals that will allow us to feel as if we're in his body as he experiences this journey? It was very much like, can we set the audience, in his eyes and sort of see the world, and what exists in the archive that it will allow us to kind of capture that sort of firsthand experience. So it was, ultimately very personally driven, then having this layer of kind of witness testimony from those who were with him, and then really trying to come up with a visual language that would create an experience. I think the other thing that was guiding us was this sense that we knew the film, it should feel like an evening of Ailey, like what you feel like, and the journey you go on whenever you go to an evening's performance. There's this extraordinary journey, and it was the same thing too with Rennie Harris's work. He was really creating this journey, and so the film had to do that as well. And it was terrifying, to be clear. Taking on two artists, two extraordinary choreographers, and having the kind of beautiful responsibility of shaping it, but that was kind of the goal.
I mean, I'm also interested, Jamila, in listening to you speak in terms of you not coming from essentially a dance background, and honoring it's a dance film, but it's also not a dance film.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm interested in how you, as coming from a film background, I felt you were so honoring to Rennie Harris, to Robert Battle, to the histories and the legacies of Ailey. And as a kind of, if I can say, a non-dance person, but how, as a filmmaker, how did you approach this notion of how to capture the dance? And as you say, it makes sense. You do feel when you watch the film that you're having an evening with Ailey. So I'm interested in that.
Yeah, that was, an evolution for sure. Before starting the film, I was a huge fan of the Ailey Dance Company. I wasn't as familiar with him. But I think one thing that we felt was like movement was going to be essential. So even in the archival footage, you'll notice that no frames are static. Bodies are in motion constantly. And we wanted that because we kept saying, well, this is a person who ultimately dance becomes their voice. And so what does that mean? And what was he noticing? He's running off to these juke joints in Texas to watch bodies move. He's seeing his mother. People are in fields doing physical labor. So bodies are in movement. Bodies are crossing, leaving fields at sunset. In church, the things that he spoke about was often his memories were memories of movement. And so I think that really helped us frame our archival for Rennie Harris's stuff. I mean, that was the first day that we came in. We had no idea what he was doing, and he didn't really know. He had assembled the bodies and he had a few ideas. I think, as all choreographers do, you make the work as you go, which was, for a filmmaker, I was like, yeah, but what's your plan? What's your plan? He's like, I don't know yet. Just shoot what's happening in the room. I'm like, okay, which is like the process we have during editing. But yeah, that first day they ran through the first phrase of dance, and my cinematographer was like, oh no, it was fast paced. It was, and so we just, again, I think thinking through like the themes that Rennie was exploring, how those themes connected with what Mr. Ailey was exploring, and then looking for the dance movements that would be the sort of best embodiment of any given theme. The day that we filmed the solo piece that Daniel Harder dances, this moment of loneliness, I mean, we knew, like, as we were filming it, there's no way this passage of the hour-long evening performance isn't going to be there, because it's so hit. Yeah. It just captured in dance what we felt Mr. Ailey was sort of experiencing at that point. And I think Robert Bettles talked about this a lot, and it's a very great compliment. And it is a huge compliment really to my editor, who is just phenomenal, that we understood that, dance is, it's abstract. It's not speaking literally. And film, especially documentary, can sometimes, it's always telling you what to know, what to think. And so something we were wrestling with was like, when can we start to strip away the talking? And when can movement language take over? And can we get the same meaning from a body in motion that we would from somebody saying, telling us the full story of Mr. Ailey's, at a certain time, kind of deep loneliness, alienation, sort of confusion. And so we really were reliant, we really decided, let's just do it. Let's just do what dance does, which is we don't have to speak it. We can let the body in motion tell us something. And for some people that's really working and successful. I think other audiences are like, wait, you didn't tell me how I should feel. And it's like, I know, but so I'm glad that that's coming across.
Yeah, I mean, there's that beautiful line in the film. I'm not sure who speaks it. I think it might be the one of the voices, but it says that, we didn't have to go and protest on the street, because everything that we wanted to say was in our bodies and in the dance that we were doing.
That was Mr. Faison. He says that line.
And it struck me as something very, there's a synergy of struggles in our own context in South Africa, where the body has been so highly politicized, obviously because of legislations and rules, that the dancing body is an interesting politics, and I mean, on that, Mr. Faison, if there's also a beautiful line in the film, and I think Rennie Harris says it, where he says, a dancer is a physical historian, and that a dancer holds information from the past, the present, and the future. And I wondered for you, as someone who embodies Ailey's work in your own body, you've become a choreographer yourself, the past, present, and future. How did it feel watching the film and going through those memories and being part of this? And I think you're muted, so you might want to just unmute.
Motion without words. No, joking, but it's like our lives are so connected. We move in different ways. We often ignore each other. We embrace each other. We do a lot of things. the structure that we say that is not there because we are trying to do something without words. And dancing is a really physical thing. So when we are reaching beyond those footlights and into that darkness again, it allows us to kind of step back and imagine something. As an actor prepares, a dancer prepares. So it is how you stumble out of the wing or glide or jeté or jump or whatever you do in coming out of the wing, you have no control over after you are like at a quarter mark on the stage. And everything you do is a part of that sentence or that paragraph that you have to speak during the time that you have life on the stage. And the reason that I love Alvin so much is that there was a story. And there is a story every time you see any of those dances. The people are either leaving someplace or going someplace. Mm-hmm. So there is a trajectory and an emotional build that you must have, because you're not spilling your guts the entire time, because you really want to the phrasing that you want to use, the suspense that you want the audience to feel, the defiance of the gravity that you want to go on. And making all of that seamless and so forth is what I really loved about him. But the history was there. Our story, whether we speak it, it courses through our veins, and it allows us to go anywhere. We can be anywhere, anything. But when it comes to us personally, and we want to look inside, deep inside, at the hurt, the pain, and all of the other emotions that it goes into being a complete human being, I find that he allowed us to do that. Yes, there was a definite structure, and we had to dance within those parameters, and all of your emotion had to explode or I want to say something about the quietness of being, and it's like how to modulate that, how to modulate dynamics. That's what I'm talking about, because I work with a lot of bands and so forth, Earth, Wind and Fire and so forth. In some of those introductions, the music has soared beyond you. You got to run and catch it. And there you are. And that's what life is, running and trying to catch life. That's what he did. That's what he did for me. And so that's why I could call on anything in my life would be fodder for my creation. And because creation is so lonely, so disconnected in a sense, you're going into space and allowing the forces to shape it and be it. Goes beyond who you are, where you come from, and so forth. But then you're going to find we are always more alike than we are unalike, and we feel all of those same things, and it takes all of those things. You agree, Gregory?
Absolutely, I agree totally.
And I think that's life. That's everything about all that you see. You could probably get a great deal out of a still picture, as much life out of a still picture as you can get out of a moving picture.
Yeah.
So
I'm interested also, as you speak, one of the things that came up in the film is this notion of blood memory. And I love that phrase because it speaks about ancestors, it speaks about history, it speaks about the projected futures. And I know Gregory, as a choreographer, I mean, he's made, of course, many works, but the works that have most moved me, and he knows this because I always talk to him about it, but he's made a trilogy called Beautiful. And he's also made a work called Exit Exist, which is really, all of those works are very much about your blood memory. And they are part of this notion of also going back into history and remembering history in a way that hasn't been taught or hasn't been given to us, but to relearn history through the body. And I found that always something that really pulls me to your work, Greg. And I'm listening to Mr. Faison speak about, that loneliness and the loneliness of going back into a history of archiving or excavating. And I'm interested in how, because that seems to be what Ailey did. It seems to be, as I hear you speak and as I watch the film and I get to know the process of what Ailey's doing, I feel that there's a synergy of struggles in the way you work, Greg. And I wondered if you wanted to reflect on that, maybe.
Yeah, thank you. Firstly, Jamila, the film is extraordinarily beautiful. It touches on human values, which is really something that I really appreciate. And most of the times when we speak of the Ailey Company, people only know the euphoria of what we bring on stages. And to have a film that taps into the humanity behind that euphoria, it is absolutely moving. And I was really touched on all levels by it. And to archive, for me, Leanne, because you spoke about archiving, to archive and to make work is by first and foremost allowing us to be counted in history. It allows us to have a legacy that will live much longer. And if Mr. Ailey didn't make work, we wouldn't be having a film. It is because of the work that he's made that we are able to go into reflections about so many things that are historically wrong, that have happened, that continue to happen. The most powerful in the world today have been phenomenally murderous. And what has continued to happen was, let's brainwash everybody else. Let's talk about, the things that can really conclude on a level of saying we are okay. Like in our own country, we're talking about the rainbow nation. Let's create this rainbow nation because then we can quickly forget about the past. And there's no forgetting about the past when there is not being a reparation, when there's not been acceptance of the wrong. And tapping
but Gregory, don't you think you have to see that wrong? I mean, the stage allows us to see the wrong.
That's the reason
See the wrongs. Yes, it allows us to see it. And whether you know it, whether you have studied enough of your own history to know that there is something that comes up out of you that you involuntarily give up. You know what I mean? You have no control actually of that. And that's just, and then, well, it's the spirit of that, and of what is inside you. Because what I thought I was doing is I was telling people about me, the me that they didn't know, the me that they didn't know about my people, and how we felt, that we cried. I came up in the civil rights movement and so forth, or 3 days after the civil rights movement started or something like that. But it was like, you don't know me, so I have to show you.
Absolutely. And I completely agree, Mr. Faison. And it's the reason we're making this work, so that we can be recorded.
Yes.
We can be known. And also to allow ourselves to speak also on behalf of those who can't speak for themselves. And I think the stage And us working with the body allows us the freedom to not be caged or to be only understood in what words understand, but because the body can really function in such multiple ways that it touches on the soul, it touches on the spiritual level, it touches to, it speaks to God even, it speaks to our ancestors. That you cannot deny. That truth you cannot deny.
Greg, I also know, I mean, one of the kind of narratives in the film that was also for me difficult and moving was also the kind of HIV narratives, the narratives around Ailey's own, the kind of intersectionality around his own sexuality, and the kind of perhaps silence at that time, and the fact that he kind of mostly hid his HIV status. And I mean, I know for you as an HIV activist, as a gay man, as someone who embodies the notions of the challenges, particularly in the African continent, around, you know, the politics of homosexuality, the politics of sexual identity. And I know that you've been a huge activist and a very powerful voice for this. And I kind of felt to be interested also to see how those voices, because obviously times have shifted, and perhaps in this day and age, there would have been a different story for Ailey speaking about that, and a different kind of consciousness around the pandemic of HIV and AIDS. And I wondered how you felt watching that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, to be honest with you, Leanne, for me, it was about how do we go past, or how do we allow ourselves to really transform our notion of acceptance, to go beyond the politics. Even with the vaccine now, there is, you know, can we go just beyond the politics and provide Africa with vaccine? You know, because we are so much now entrapped in terms of, you know, the powers of the world. Who is most powerful, who controls what, and who gives access to even life for someone else, to exist beyond just the moment. And that for me is what really touched me about the film, to say, oh goodness, you know, what could have happened if there was that help in the beginning, in the onset?
Yeah.
When we had accepted that this is a disease that needs to be treated with utmost care and sensitivity, what could have happened? And we are still left with those questions even today, because in South Africa, we're dealing with a different phenomenon that is attacking our own people who are marginalized. LGBT plus community is under attack in our own country. People are dying and being murdered on everyday basis. And our leadership, our political leadership, is mute about it. So there is, how do we go beyond? How do we go beyond just the politics and deal with the real issues that affect humanity?
Yeah.
Because
I mean, I think that's also, you know, I'm sorry, Greg, to interrupt you, but I think that's also one of the most beautiful narratives in the film, Jamila, is that, you know, the silence around that, and exactly Greg's thing is, what happens if it had have been different? And it raises many questions around silence. I mean, we've spoken about, you know, the silence of histories, of Black histories, the silences of certain voices, but also the silences of sexual identities of those. So, and it's a very powerful narrative, because it leaves you feeling there's sadness, there's sorrow, there's great sorrow in that.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to remember is that part of what I was aiming to do with the film was to not center the stories, not center the oppressive force, right? So we look at Black life and we experience Black joy because Mr. Ailey, in creating his earliest works at least, looked at the wealth of his community. He wasn't, not you know, his dances were not like, oh, the Jim Crow sign that tells you can't drink at this water fountain. Sure, that's the oppressive system, but it didn't destroy the people in the system. And he's saying there's struggle, but look at the beauty. Like, look at what we do on a Saturday night and how community remains intact and family can love you. And, you know, I don't think that's because he was in denial about it. It's just that, as we were sort of talking about earlier, you can't let the oppressive force destroy the narrative of, you know, an intact human community. And I think on every level, that was the goal. So early in the film, he has a beautiful experience with, you know, a boy. And we allow, you know, in those tapes, the two relationships he speaks about are this early experience with Chauncey and this later experience with Abdullah. And in both instances, they were relationships. One was quite beautiful, one was challenged. He didn't talk about the oppression that he was facing. I don't think we can ignore that it existed, but did he have personal shame, or did the community want him to be ashamed? And so I think with with HIV especially, it's like, we don't want to conflate his sexuality, of which everybody knew what his sexuality was. He wasn't applying for grants with that affinity group listed, because you couldn't in 1958, right? It's like, he wasn't a Black queer dance maker in 1962 who could have gotten State Department funding for that, right? That's not going to happen. But there's a difference, I think, with HIV, which is, at that time, it's 1989. I mean, ACT UP, which was a very political force here, had barely started. They were starting to do their movement, but it was a very specific time. And it, now we could say it should have been treated as like heart disease or cancer or diabetes. You have this illness, we're going to give you drugs. And instead, it's stigma, 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 shame, stigma, shame. And there was so much at risk. So the silence is, I think about, I mean, for me, it was wrestling with this idea of, well, what is the choice he has to make to disclose his status and the very institution and enterprise he had created that allows so many other people to dance? And, you know, it's completely jeopardized at that point, right? Which is what Bill T. Jones is saying. Like, can he actually be completely transparent at that time, 1989? No. Or the personal choice of aligning himself with something political. I don't know. Mr. Faison can speak to it, more clearly. But I think you can't ever forget. It's why we put Reagan in that footage. You know, who is like denying
the suppressor.
Yeah.
Oppressor. But yeah, but it's true. But going back, just taking a step back just a little bit, I think that in order to define the human condition, or to even reflect the human condition, I think that you have to possess the sexuality of both gender. I think that you couldn't tell a ballerina how to do the swan lake unless the choreographer showed her that those wings were real, or any of the things that you are trying to convey to people. Again, there is nothing but ignorance out there. So you have the job, whether you're trying to do your sexuality, it doesn't really matter. But if you wanted to have some empathy, have it, give it, whatever, you're going to have to open yourself up to all of that. I mean, you're not going to edit yourself in the middle of a dance, or as those emotions are rushing, about to form that movement, or make that contraction that you're feeling happen, or whatever. But it's like that you have to give yourself up to that. I don't think you have any control over that.
Yeah.
And that's what, and also we have to see it to believe it. You have to see it. And it may be some of the good things in life, the bad things, it has to be seen. And that's where what we have, we have deconstructed so much that the heart has become something else. And as opposed to we've been trying to get people to level with us, come clean with me, speak to me, and so forth, when that may maybe that could happen if you just touched me, put your arm around me, shook my hand, and enclosed that in yours. Something human.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, Jamila, I found that narrative, and as Mr. Faison speaking, I found there was huge empathy in the film. And I really, I asked the question because I felt the complexity of it, and that the tactile thing of absolutely just opening your hand to make it okay, Toby, I'd like to, oh, sorry, Mr. Faison.
Oh no, we're waiting to hear from her as well.
Yeah.
I'll hold mine. No, she can speak.
So Toby, I mean, you're a young generation of South African dance makers and choreographers and arts administrator, academic, and I'm interested for you as well. If we're looking at this notion of revised history, and in South Africa, we're talking a lot about the decolonizing that goes along with our continent around how we understand how history is taught, and how what Ngugi wa Thiong'o calls the cultural bomb that makes us not want to respect and own and love what it is that we are, rather than the histories that are taught to us. And I'm wondering for you, as this young, incredibly beautiful, gifted human being, how this history and this memory affects you.
Thanks, Lutz. So thank you very much, Jamila, for this movie. Wow, because I think for me, it brought a very different understanding and reappreciation, I suppose, for what Alvin Ailey did in his time, but also how I can start to rethink the things that I do now. I'm very much at the moment grappling with this idea of how do we, in a space where we say that we now have been given voice, start to use that voice, and what are the stories that we begin to tell, the stories that are honest when we know what our histories have been and what the history of silence has been. Like Lutz has mentioned, Gregory's made some amazing works that speak to his own history, but I know that they speak to my own history as well. And it's that blood memory, and it's the stuff that runs and courses through us. And what I really loved about the movie was that it was more than what you find on Wikipedia or in your drama pack, or even as a dance scholar, it was more than what I had perceived, and therefore also shelved away as this is American, and this has got nothing really to, yes, it's Black dances, but it's got nothing to do with my context. You really put Alvin Ailey at a place where, sure, I feel like he's doing what I'm researching now. He was doing it back then, and he did it with such honesty. And I think he does all the things that decolonization, asks us to do. He challenges the ideas of that, because I'm seen as this, I should behave like this. And how you then portray that or give that back to us in a way where you don't center the oppressor, you don't center the story of the time that is the story that is known. Like if people come to South Africa, it's apartheid, and you guys are oppressed, and therefore you can't be this, and then it's such a surprise when the Black Coffees and the Gregory McCormas get to other worlds, and they suddenly are these, but you guys can dance, and you can make music, and like it's international standard, and that's what he did, right? When they got to Australia and they got off that plane, and there was hardly anybody in the audience, clearly because a Black company who wants to go watch that. But then when they get there and they do their thing, it's like, whoa, hang on, a Black company can do what? So I think for me, it really, it's been wonderful, firstly, listening to everybody speak about it and speak about these ideas about what sits in our bodies and what sits with our ancestors. And I think Alvin Ailey also, his beginnings are there, is that he goes back to that, but also like how it's all like it's on every level, it's on every single level of his life. And I think if we all continue to do that, or if we all recognize that in each other, because I think we're all doing it, right? If he was doing it and I'm thinking about it, I'm sure we're not the only two people in that time period that it's happened. So if we continue just to really push for that and to really just start to see it in everybody's worlds and work, what a beautifully textured world we live in, you know? And now I don't even know if I've answered your question, Ruth.
Of course you have, of course you have. I mean, it does speak about the layers of history. I mean, Jamila, also, I was very interested with, you know, the voice of Bill T. Jones in the film, because I kind of felt like, you know, as a documentary maker, there's, you know, and if I can use Mr. Faison's, the full humanity means that we're not unflawed human beings. And I thought that the inclusion of the kind of very loving, critical voice of Bill T. Jones was just so beautiful, because it spoke to Bill T. Jones's love of Ailey, but also complex relationship. But it also spoke of a kind of way in which we can also see humanity in its in the little things that are difficult and awkward. And I wondered, as a filmmaker, how you felt with you know, bringing that into the documentary.
Yeah, bringing in Bill T. Jones was interesting because he isn't as close a collaborator, obviously, as Mr. Faison, certainly Miss Jamison, Sylvia Waters, and those voices. But I did feel like it was interesting when we did that interview that day. I think Bill T. Jones himself is in a kind of new relationship with Mr. Ailey and what he did. I think if you had interviewed Bill T. Jones in 1980, he has a very different sense of both Mr. Ailey and the Ailey Company, in part because, you know, I think because the Ailey Company was so successful, often for Black dancers in those years coming, it's like, go to Ailey, Ailey will finish you. Ailey, you know, you're an Ailey dancer just because you're Black. And maybe you aren't actually. And, you know, for Mr. Faison, that was a place that made sense and you wanted to go there. For somebody like Bill T. Jones, who actually was more himself drawn to the work of, say, a Cunningham, he felt very, you know, there was that kind of stereotyping that I think Mr. Ailey himself would have been like, that's crazy. Like, you don't need to come do what you want to do and what makes sense to you. But he is very aware of a kind of road that was paved. I mean, you know, he understands that had there not been a Mr. Ailey, there could not have been a Bill T. Jones, because there was just this work that was being done that cut down some of the brush to allow you to walk on a path and then make a new path. And I think I find it really interesting to think too about, you know, it's not in the film, but I guess, you know, he had asked Mr. Ailey once, like, well, what do you think about the downtown avant-garde scene? And Mr. Ailey said something like, well, I like it when you guys are dancing, you know, like some kind of quip, right?
I know, that's the truth.
Exactly. You know, so there was a critique.
Is the music in the same room?
Right. So there was that critique, and yet when there is a PBS program being filmed, Mr. Ailey says, you know what, people need to see Bill T. Jones's work because this is exciting, it's new, it's innovative, it's not what I do, but it's a new thing, and let's give him a platform. And so I think that dialogue between the two of them is intriguing. And in terms of the critique, I think he was the only person I thought who could own that space and bring that critique as somebody whose, you know, partner dies basically in the same year, I think, as Mr. Ailey, who had been more forthcoming about his status, his own status. And yet I think he is very aware of the complexity of that moment at that time, and the kind of impossible choice that's there. And yet, you know, was there, you know, as you were saying, Greg, was there a different possibility? Had the situation been different? Could different choices have been made? And it felt like we had to also be honest about it. It didn't feel like, I don't think it would have been, as a documentarian, sort of ethically appropriate for me not to address that kind of elephant in the room. And, you know, this film is very much a love letter, but I also couldn't abandon, you know, he wasn't flawed, he wasn't a perfect human being, and he had complicated reasons for, making the choices that he made. And I think I just wanted audiences to wrestle with the tension for him in that moment. And I thought, Bill T. Jones kind of best voiced it and had the kind of most authority in that moment to lodge the critique as a younger generation person who probably really would have loved it if there was this very prominent figure who himself could have aligned himself politically with the battle that was then going to be waged and continues to be waged. Because similarly today, the community that is most vulnerable in the United States is still, working class Black people are still most susceptible, have least access to the drugs, and so all of that is kind of wrapped up in there. For, again, I think an audience who brings some, as I said, like it's in many ways a film for the uninitiated. I just thought if you don't fully understand something, go off and do some research on your own. I wanted to make something that was an experience. And so we weren't going to unpack the whole history because we were seeing it as Mr. Ailey lived it. Sorry, George, Mr. Faison, I cut you off. What were you going to?
I almost forgot what I was going to say, but I think that when you talk about Bill T, they decided what they were going to be. I mean, and so forth. But I'm in the theater, and I was hired, or you're hired to be. Before we decided we could be any kind of butterfly, we could be. We can always do that. But I'm saying that his work demanded you be a man.
Right.
Because of this
right.
And demanded you, hey, this is how these men are good. And you love that, some of those, because all of those men had subtext. They all came from other jobs. They all came, from other places, circumstances. Some grew up with family, with fathers, some didn't, and so forth. What kind of man are we actually going to be? He was the best. I think he was able to be the best man that he could be. And enjoy all of the pleasures and the gifts that this world can offer you. But in outside of even that, he could create a world where everybody could be in accord or discord. And the brilliance of supplying to the audience a map, in a sense, as how to navigate some of these feelings that you may not have ever felt, and introduce you to those things, not completely change it, because you're looking at me, and sometimes you wouldn't think that I was capable even of that. Feelings. Do you know what I mean? Because so many people feel that something else is happening. But cut me, I'll bleed red, like it. And it's our understanding, all of that. I would love to see, some of those heartbreak dances on everybody else. You have them. You have those joyous ones too. But the point is, and it's with choreographers, what is going to live? What do you ultimately want it to resonate? When somebody looks at it, who has lived a life and maybe has grown cold and impervious to the things that are happening around us, because we've gone through so much. We could all say, at this life, we've gone through all of these diseases, all of these pandemics, all of these things. How are they? And we don't think about them until they are visited at our door. And then we think we're alone, but we are there to tell them you're not alone. So we have we've got to show all of that, but at the same time, you still got to show hope. The disparity of life and all that it presents, just getting through. But then if you're gonna say all that about how awful the world is, there has to be a moment to say how beautiful, how wonderful this experience is.
Yeah. It's the love letter. It's the love letter that Jamila's made. And you know, for me, Bill T. Jones's voice is not it's a loving critique, because he himself, there's clear love, and it's the filmmaker's love, you know. And it's the same if I think about Gregory's work. I think about the harsh truths that often come in that work that are sometimes quite, but it's always couched in a humanity, in a kind of, you know, a searching for a true self. And, you know, dance is that, you know, so.
And I think if I can just add to that, I just want to say, I think, you know, that's guided, again, because we said it has to map the journey he creates. So the film takes this journey because it's inspired by him. It's built the way that it is because that's the kind of messages he leaves us with. But I think the thing that's also so powerful, and I feel this mostly, Cry is now my favorite. I really love the solos, and Cry obviously was always very important. But the thing about that dance to me is that I don't think her circumstances change, right? You meet a woman who is in struggle, who is alone, who is brutalized, who is undergoing all of this pain. And by the end, I don't think she has necessarily escaped those circumstances. I don't think she's really transcended. To me, she's gone in and found the thing that none of that can. And to me, that is, I mean, could be on one day, it might be cold comfort. On another day, it really is that she finds something that is, cannot be taken away. And I think that is not because Mr. Ailey was living a life where he's like, I've realized it, I've found it. Every day I wake up and I feel secure and confident and psychically intact. It's like, no, the work is to what can we turn to feel psychically intact. And the joy at the end of that dance is like, that's the thing. You know, you can't, the history says we haven't been broken. We haven't been broken. We are all here. And that is because we have histories, we have stories, we come from places that are real. The narrative of nothingness cannot actually totally penetrate you. And I think that's, you know, in that dance, and obviously, you know, Revelations does that with a whole cast of dancers. But to see one woman sort of engage in that journey, to me, that's the gift that and the power that, you know, he gives me. So I think people tend to say, oh, well, the dance is so hopeful at the end. I'm like, is it? That woman might wake up tomorrow and still have to scrub those damn floors. I don't know that her life has changed, but she has something now.
But I think that she's found release.
Yes.
And it's a shout that she's doing.
Yes.
So it's nothing.
Cry.
Yes, you know, and a shout is an incredible release. You don't need anybody else to do that. It's between you and God at that point, and how you feel, and then and everything resonates at that moment, and unto yourself, life,
right.
You know, life affirming.
Right, I am. Right, I am. I mean, that is the thing I think for all of us in the histories that we've experienced, that is the thing there that the narrative tries to strip you of, right? Like
and
you wake up
and the colonial.
Exactly, of course, right.
So you're trying to remember through all of that. Yeah, through all of that blood too. All of that blood, all of that suffering, all of that, something is going to take me to the other side. I will see Jordan in the morning. I will ride that chariot all the way, and so forth. It's just so much hope that you can turn on. That's a great thing.
Greg, I want to ask Greg. I mean, and you know, listening to Mr. Faison talk about that kind of making it to Jordan and the hope. How do you experience that in your work?
Well, I mean, for me, the body is a starting point, and I always treat it as a temple, that preciously archives all these complexities, and they become visible when a concrete force really pushes you to get to a point of rapture. And for me, it has to get to that point where I say, I cannot take it anymore. I'm experiencing a rupture. And that
yes.
is, for me, comes on in terms of how we conceptualize and consequently reproducing its own existence, because at the end of the day, it's about the body saying, I want to stand for myself. And how do I reclaim at this particular moment, at this particular time, to be who I want to be? And for me, there need to be that force. There needs to be that rupture that takes you to that point where you experience a concrete force. Because by experiencing a concrete force, you know that I need these weapons. I need this. I need to arm myself with these things so that I can stand. How do I empower myself from having gone through all of those experiences and complexities? And how do I empower myself in order to empower others? I love choreography when it does that, because it is out of my own experience that I go through that I can say, now I want to empower others, because I have felt the extraordinary force that is pushing me to a point of rupture.
Yes. Amen.
I mean, I see that in Rennie Harris's work that he makes for the Ailey Company. I mean, exactly what you've just said is exactly what Rennie Harris, he brings Ailey to those young dancers, who are not just learning repertoire, they're learning the archive of Ailey's body and memory. I see we're kind of running out of time, and I wish we weren't, because I would love to talk all evening, and I'm going to wrap it up, and because I think it is our hour, but it's been an incredible conversation, and an incredible film, Jamila, that has resonances that are, of course, about Alvin Ailey, but that just wave out about presence, being, humanity, spirit, rising. I love the word that you used, a phrase. You said you wanted to make a film that was a sensory, poetic, documentary portrait. And I think you've done that, but I think you've done more than that. I think that you've found a way of using a past history to navigate a future history. And I think it's a really beautiful film, and it's moved me, and I thank you very much for it. So I would like to say thank you. Greg.
Can I just add one more thing? I mean, on top of everything that you've just said, is that you've also given us the human face of the Ailey Company. We travel, I mean, the Ailey Company travels everywhere in the world. And that's the company that I got to see, that I said to myself, I need to do this in South Africa, to create a Black dance company that every child who's Black who wants to dance, they know that they can find a place that they can go to. So thank you for that film, because it has given us that face that we didn't know. We know there's an Ailey Company, but we don't know the face. So thank you for that.
Thank you,
Greg.
And thank you.
So I'm saying good night to everyone. And for those who haven't seen the film, please go and engage it. It's the most beautiful film, and I hope that there will be more platforms in which we can watch it and engage it. And thank you, Mr. Faison, for your beautiful poetry and your presence. Toby, thank you always for being with us and bringing your spirit. And Greg, always beautiful to talk to you. And Jamila, thank you for the love letter.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Thank
you.
Good night.
I'm gonna come there. I'm gonna find you.
I'll come to you.
I'm gonna come to you. Okay.
Bye, everyone. Good night.
Okay. Take
Good
care.
night, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you.